Hey guys, today's first chapter Friday is called Ruined by Amy Tintera. So, this was actually a Truman nominee a couple of years ago. It's sort of unique in the way that it blends so many genres together. So, there's action, there's adventure, it's kind of like a twist on a fairy tale, there's a little bit of romance, there's a whole lot of attempted murder. It's really, really good. So, here we go. Chapter 1. The wheels of the carriage creaked as they rolled across the dirt road. The noise echoed through the quiet forest. Em crouched behind a tree, tightening each finger individually around her sword. A squirrel darted across the road and disappeared into the thick brush. She couldn't see the princess or her guards yet. She glanced over her shoulder to find Damayan hiding in a squat behind the bush, his body perfectly still. He didn't even appear to be breathing. That was Damayan, incredibly fast or incredibly still, depending on what the situation called for. Aaron was in a tree on the other side of the road from M, precariously perched atop a branch with his sword drawn. Both boys stared at her, waiting for her signal. M pressed her hand at the tree trunk and peered around it. The sun was setting behind her, and she could see wisps of their breath in the air. She shivered. The first guard rounded the corner on his horse, easily spotted in his bright yellow and black coat. Yellow was the official color of Valos, the princess's home, but M would have made them wear black. She would have insisted that several guards scout the area around the carriage. Apparently, the princess wasn't that smart. Or maybe she felt safe in her own country. M barely remembered what safe felt like. She shivered again, but not because of the cold. Every nerve in her body was on high alert. The carriage rolled down the road behind the first guard, pulled by 4 horses. There were 5 guards total, 1 in front, 2 on either side, and 2 in back. All of them were perched on top of horses, swords dangling from their belts. The princess must have been inside the carriage. 6-3. M, Damayan, and Aaron had faced much worse odds. The guard in front said something to one of the men behind him, and they both laughed. The spot of blue on their chests wasn't clear from this distance, but M knew what it was. Soldiers who had killed at least 10 Ruined wore blue pens. For every 10 killed, they received another pen. The man in front had at least 3. She looked forward to wiping the smile off of that guard's face. M returned her attention to Damayan. She barely nodded. He stood slowly, a dagger in one hand and a sword in the other. He lifted the dagger and narrowed his eyes at the target, and the blade sailed through the air. M jumped up. Damayan's dagger sank into the throat of the guard at the side of the carriage, and a scream rippled through the air. He toppled off his horse, and the other guards quickly dismounted, swords drawn. The horses neighed loudly, and one of them ran, hoofs clomping as it disappeared into the trees. Aaron jumped from his tree and landed on top of the 2 guards, his sword cutting through the air and finding his target. Damayan sprinted for the man trying to block the side door of the carriage. The guard's face was twisted in horror, his fear palpable. That left only one man, the one in front, and he was staring straight at M. She clenched her sword tighter as she raced toward him. He grabbed something off of his back. She barely had time to process the bow before the arrow was hurtling straight for her. She darted to one side, but the arrow sliced across her left arm. She gasped at the quick shot of pain, but she didn't have time to let it slow her down. She broke into a run as he reached for another arrow. He aimed and she dashed out of the way, narrowly missing the second one. Damayan appeared behind him. He drove his sword into the guard's back, and the man gasped and fell to his knees. And whirled around to find Princess Mary jumping out of the carriage, sword in hand. A burst of relief exploded in M's chest as she surveyed the princess. They had the same dark hair and olive skin. Mary had green eyes, while M's were dark, and Mary had small, delicate features, making her pretty in a way that M would never be. But from a distance, most people wouldn't be able to tell them apart. Em lifted her sword as Mary rushed toward her, but the princess stumbled back suddenly, pulled by an invisible force. Her fingers sprang apart and her sword clattered to the ground. Aaron stood behind Mary, his gaze fixed on her as he used his ruined magic to keep her in place. Em had no magic, but she was better than almost anyone with a sword. She shook her head at Aaron, and he released his hold on Mary. She didn't need his help. Em took a small step back, allowing the princess to retrieve her sword. She wanted to beat the princess in every sense of the word. She wanted to see Mary's face when she realized Em had bested her. The anger trickled in at first, hesitant, like perhaps fear was a better emotion right now. But Em embraced the anger, let it swirl and grow until it tightened around her chest and made it hard to breathe. Em attacked first, and Mary raised her sword to block Em's. The princess kept watch on Demayan, but Em knew neither of her friends would jump in to help again unless it was absolutely necessary. They knew she needed to do this for herself. Em lunged at Mary again, spraying dirt into the air, and Mary raised her sword and Em ducked, letting the blade sail above her head. She bolted to her feet, slicing her sword across Mary's right arm. The princess gasped and stumbled, and Em took advantage of that moment of weakness. She launched her sword against Mary's, knocking it out of the princess's hand. Em took a step forward, aiming the tip of her blade at the princess's neck. Her hand shook, and she gripped her sword tighter. She'd imagined this part of the plan 100 times, but she hadn't counted on the sick feeling in the pit of her stomach. Do you know who I am? Em asked. Mary shook her head, her chest heaving up and down. I believe you knew my father, Em said. You killed him and left his head on a stick for me to find. Mary pressed her lips together, her eyes darting from Em to the blade at her neck. Her mouth opened, a squeak coming out before she spoke. The princess cut herself off and ducked, grabbing for something on her ankle. She bolted upright, a dagger in one hand, and she lunged for Em. Em dove to one side, and panic seized her chest for a moment. If Mary killed her or escaped, the entire plan would crumble. Mary swung at her again, and Em grabbed her wrist, yanking the arm with the dagger to the sky. With her other hand, Em drove the sword into the princess's chest. The blue pins hit the ground with a soft clink. Im counted as Demayan and Aaron ripped them off the coats of the dead Valos guards. 9 pins total between them, 90 ruined, killed, just by these 5 men. She leaned down and scooped up the pins. The 2 interlocking circles symbolized the union of 2 countries, Lara and Valos, and their fight against the dangerous ruined. The sword that cut across the circles symbolized their strength. Em dropped 5 pens into Aaron's hand. Put them in your coat. But the Lara guard will respect you more. Actually, she added one more, 6, and you'll be a star. Aaron's mouth twisted like he'd eaten something sour, but he put the pins back on one of his coats without protest. He slipped one arm through the yellow and black coat and then the other. He buttoned the 5 gold buttons and ran his hand down the front, straightening the material. Do I look like a Valos guard? He grabbed his sword. Wait, it's more realistic when I swing my sword around like I have no idea how to use it. Now I look good, right? He grinned too widely, showing off dimples on both cheeks. She snorted. Perfect. She pointed to where blood dotted his dark skin above his eyebrow. You're bleeding. Aaron wiped his forehead as Em dropped the remaining 3 pins onto Mayan's hand. Get rid of those. We don't want the hunters finding them and getting suspicious. Demayan slipped the pens into his pocket. I'll burn them with the bodies. Em's gaze slid into the wagon behind him, where the princess and her guards were piled. A piece of Mary's long, dark hair stuck out from beneath the blanket at the back of the wagon, almost touching the dirt. She looked away from the wagon. Her mother had always said that the only way to find peace was to kill everyone who threatened it. But the tight feeling in Em's chest remained. I should take care of the bodies as soon as possible, Demayan said. Em nodded and turned to face Demayan and then quickly focused on the ground. He had that expression, the one that made her heart squeeze painfully. It was a mix of sadness and hope and maybe even love. He stepped forward and she wrapped her arms around him, the familiar smell of him enveloping her. He knew she wasn't capable of returning her feelings. Not now. Revenge swelled and twisted and burned inside of her and left room for nothing else. Sometimes it would simmer down for a while, and she would think it was gone, but it would always return. She would be back at her home, her lungs filled with smoke and her eyes watering as she peered around a corner, staring as King Solomir pulled his bloody sword out of Emsa's mother's chest, hearing her sister's screams, finding her father a few weeks later after Princess Mary had killed him. Maybe when she killed the king and his family, she'd be able to feel something else. Maybe then she'd be able to look at Demayan the same way he looked at her. She tried to smile at him. A lump had formed in her throat, and the smile probably came out more like a grimace. She watched as Demayan said goodbye to Aaron. I should make it back to the ruined camp by tomorrow evening, Demayan said, stopping next to one of the horses pulling the wagon. He glanced at Em. Are you sure you don't want me to tell them you're trying to find Olivia? They should know there's a chance the queen may return. Em shook her head. Not yet. They voted you as their leader, and they need someone to depend on now. Let's not get their hopes up yet. Regret flashed across Demayan's face at the word leader. He was a good one, despite his young age, but he only had the position because the Ruin had turned their backs on Em. She might have been heir to the throne with her mother dead and her sister missing, but she was useless, powerless, not fit to lead, a Ruin had said when they demanded Demayan take over a year ago. Keep them safe, she said. I'll wait to hear from you. Demayan climbed into the wagon, putting his right fist to his chest and tapping it once. The fist tap was the official Rowena salute to the queen, and something no one but Demayan and Aaron had ever done for her. Em blinked tears away. She lifted her hand, waving goodbye, and Demayan did the same. The ruined marks on his hand and wrist were visible, a reminder of why he couldn't even consider coming with them. The marks let the world know that he was a ruined with power, and Em lacked power, so she also lacked the ruined marks. It was completely dark now, and Demayan's figure disappeared quickly, the clomping of hooves echoing through the night. She turned back to Aaron, who was pulling his collar away. Aaron had barely escaped the burning Rowena castle alive, and much of his upper body told the story. They also hid the story of his ruined magic, as the fire had burned away all traces of his ruined marks. And his marks had been beautiful, white against his dark skin, the thin lines twisting together and creating spirals all over his arms and back and chest. Ready? He asked quietly. She grasped her necklace and rubbed her thumb over the silver O. No. She'd been planning this for almost a year, and she would never be ready. We should be able to make it to the Lyra border by morning, Aaron said as he walked to the carriage and climbed up. He gestured behind him. Do you want to ride in the carriage like a real Valos princess? Emma headed for one of the horses. Not yet. I'll ride a bit and scout the area. I'll get in when we approach the Lyra border. She swung one leg over the horse and settled onto the saddle. She glanced over at Aaron to see her friend watching her, his head cocked to one side. What? Your mother would be proud, Em. He bowed his head slightly at the mention of their dead queen. I hope so. The words came out as a whisper. She was certain her mother would be furious that Em had allowed her younger, more powerful sister to be taken by the Lyra king. Em was supposed to protect Olivia, and she had failed. But she would make it right. She would save her sister and kill the man who had taken her and murdered their mother. Make people feel you, Emiliana, her mother's words echoed in her head. Stop worrying about what you don't have and start focusing on what you do. Make people tremble when they hear your name. Fear is your power. Wynda Flores had never known the days when the ruined were feared for their powers and revered as gods, but she longed for those days. She wanted nothing more than to make those humans bow down in terror. Em lifted her head, fixing her gaze straight ahead. No one feared Emilina Flores, the useless daughter of the most powerful queen Rowena had ever known. But they would. And that is chapter 1 of Ruin. So it is a series. There are another 2 books after this, and they are in the library. If you are interested in this, I have 3 copies, so be sure to come down and check it out.